Hello, everybody. Welcome. We'll just wait for a few moments for everybody to join the platform before we start. Thanks. Okay, we can get going. Thank you very much, first of all, everybody. Very warm welcome to this Guardian live event. I'm Jon Henley. I'm the Guardian's Europe correspondent. I'm based in Paris, and I'll be your host for the next 75 minutes. So we're here this evening to explore some of the biggest challenges that Europe faces right now, how they might reshape the continent. Rising migration, climate breakdown, the rise of populist and nationalist parties, the cost of living crisis, the monumental fallout from Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Europe's relations with the rest of the world, especially China and the US. I mean, they're all issues that are going to have and are already having a huge impact on Europeans' lives, but that we can't kind of really understand or tackle through a national prism. You know, the biggest challenges are those that are not limited by national borders. So we'll be spending this event, the next 75 minutes, looking at these challenges. We're not obviously trying to solve them, but we're looking at how they might play out and some of the ways that they might be addressed. So I'm really delighted to welcome a fantastic panel for this event from all across Europe. In Greece, where she is at the moment for an academic conference, is Catherine Fieschi, who's a political scientist. She founded the independent research group Counterpoint, and she's considered really one of Europe's leading experts on populism and the far right. She's currently director of policy at the Open Societies Foundation Europe, but she's about to take up a new post as senior fellow at the Robert Schuman Center of the European University Institute in Florence. In Paris is Rokhaya Diallo. Hi, bonsoir. Who's a writer, an activist, an award-winning filmmaker. Rokhaya is a regular contributor to The Guardian's opinion pages, and she's probably best known for her work on racial equality. The New York Times, no less, has called her one of France's most prominent anti-racism activists. And finally, in Brussels, where else, we have Sophie in het Veld, a campaigning Dutch MEP, goedenavond, who's spent almost 20 years now in the European Parliament. In June, she left her long-term party, the Liberal Progressive D66 Dutch party, over policy disagreements, and she's joined Veld, which maybe we could talk about in a bit. It's Europe's first properly pan-European political party, and a really interesting development. Anyway, she's known for asking some extremely awkward questions in Parliament, and she's just published a book called Naked Power that urges a really radical overhaul of the way the EU works so that it can face up precisely to these new challenges that we're going to spend the evening discussing. First of all, just before we kick off, some sort of housekeeping very briefly. This is just so that I explain how the evening will go. We will have a panel discussion among the four of us for about 40 minutes or so, but we really want to hear from you. And we'll spend the whole second half of the event fielding your questions, I hope. So if you're watching us on Zoom, you can already start sending questions now via the Q&A button. And if you're watching us on the Guardian.com website, then please use X, formerly known as Twitter, as we have to say. You can use the hashtag Guardian Live, or you can ping us directly at Guardian Live. And just a final small point, you're obviously not obliged to, but if you're happy to do that, then do please include your name and where you're watching us from, just so we know. Okay, so without further ado, we'll kick off. Rokhaya, I'd like to start with you, if I could, and a kind of a really fundamental question, I think, which is Europe's identity. Now, there's been a lot of talk about this lately, last few weeks and months, notably around a new book called Euro Whiteness by Hans Kundnani, which basically argues that Europe kind of likes to see itself as a place where people come together across borders. And it kind of celebrates diversity and inclusion and openness, and it's opposed to racism and nationalism and all that. But that historically, sort of Europeanness, it actually was whiteness. And so while today's Europe is trying to forget that colonial past, it still sees itself as a kind of civilizing project. So my question to you really is, has Europe really reconciled itself with its past? How well does its self-image and the identity that it likes to project today, how well does that reflect actual reality? And how much does that matter? Just to phrase it really bluntly, how truly representative can the EU be, for example, when 3% of MEPs are people of color, and there's never been a European commissioner from an ethnic minority?
Thank you so much for your question. Thanks to The Guardian for organizing that discussion. So I think that it's Hans Kundnani has it right when he ties Europeanness to whiteness. The European identity has been solidified with the idea of whiteness. The European power, the European position has been strengthened by the colonial project that has been going on for centuries. And thinking about colonization of something in the past is quite inaccurate. Officially, of course, the colonies, most of the colonies are independent. But for example, I'm French, and France is still the only country to be present on 4 continents. So of course, there is one part of France, the biggest, that is in Europe, but we have several departments that are in the Caribbean island. The only part of the south of South America, which is still under European control, is the French Guiana. We also have some territories in the Indian Ocean, in Polynesia, in the Pacific Ocean. So that means that in itself, in themselves, and even the fact that the Commonwealth is still a thing, that shows and that displays how the former colonial empires still have very, very strong colonial ties and colonial relationship with formerly colonized territories. So the idea that the European identity may be in danger just now is something that doesn't really look and that doesn't really take into account the fact that the European identity has always been complex. And many of the things that we enjoy every day came from the colonies. For example, the fact that on breakfast we can have coffee, we can have sugar, we can have tea. Those are foods that are seen as very basic, as part of the European culture. But we can enjoy them thanks to invasions, thanks to oppressions. So I think that there is still a major issue of discrimination and of structural racism, of exclusion of many of the minorities, and also a very deep work to do when it comes to the states, the European states. Many of them have been sentenced several times by the European Court of Human Rights for mistreatment, for racial and racist mistreatment. And it didn't really have an effect on how those states have still addressed racism. So I think that we shouldn't deal with colonialism as something in the past, especially given what's going on today in Africa, in Western Africa. The fact that many in the world realized that France still had There are many military troops in many countries, and some of them has decided to get rid of them, such as Burkina Faso, as Mali. But it's a process that is still ongoing. The currency that is mainly used in the former French colonies, which is the franc CFA, is tied to the euro, and it's made in Europe. So thinking about the European identity without thinking of the benefits that we still gain from the countries that are supposedly independent is just being one-sided. And I think that we need to make sure that if you want to think about the European identity, we really think about how those relationships benefit to us on a daily basis, on an economical basis, and that we cannot like think about the visa policies without thinking of the fact that many companies are still gaining money from extracting resources in Africa, and from just, you know, for example, the phone company, the internet companies, many of them are European, and they are the ones who provide services to African people. So we cannot like we shouldn't think about migration only thinking about human migrating, but also thinking about how our money is, you know, we are having money coming from formerly colonized places of the world.
Mm. Okay, well, thank you very much indeed. Yeah, it's a really interesting and important question. Sophie, an equally important and interesting question, more institutional, really, about the EU. So that I mean, the EU has never ever in its history been as powerful as it is at the moment. It's jointly procuring vaccines. It's raising money through euro bonds. It's purchasing kind of natural gas and even military material together. But you argue that the new powers that it's kind of acquiring, and that it really needs to be able to deal with all these global challenges that we've just outlined, are kind of being hijacked, and that there aren't the checks and balances within the European institutions to make sure that Europe is as well as becoming a global power, and exercising this sort of strategic autonomy that people, particularly Emmanuel Macron, is talking about. That as well as doing that, it's not, or while it's doing that, it is not at the same time become a proper parliamentary democracy, a properly democratic organization. Can you explain a little bit more about, where that problem comes from? What is it exactly, and how you think it might be resolved?
Okay. Well, first of all, let me start by saying, very often when you talk about the need for institutional reforms or governance reforms, people say, oh, well, Jon, that's all very boring. We don't want to talk about it. We want Europe to deliver. We want results. But that's actually very strange, because the way that we organize our democracy, the way we organize governance, is essential for the outcome. And we would never say, if you say, let's reform our national democracies, nobody would say it's boring. As a matter of fact, every day there are institutional reforms going on. People are debating about it. Governments even fall over it. So it is essential. But the thing is that national governments have been feeding us this myth for decades that, the European Union, it's just technocratic. So don't you worry, we'll take care of it. You just give us a mandate. We'll go to Brussels, lock the door, and then we'll let you know the outcome afterwards. Which is, okay, fine if it's only about technical issues. And it may have been that way 70 years ago. But today, the European Union is a fully fledged political entity with the ambition of being a geopolitical power. But you cannot be a geopolitical power if there are no democratic foundations. And people will say, yeah, but we have elections in Europe. You can elect the European Parliament next year, 2024, there will be elections. But elections in themselves do not make a democracy. Russia has elections, so does China. It's not a democracy. A democracy is, and I think the Brits in particular have a long history there. Think of the Magna Carta, which is just over 800 years old. Democracy is about power and checks on power. It's, because if there are no checks on power, you get absolute power. And this is what is lacking in the European Union. As a matter of fact, if we have seen for decades, the parliamentary democracy building up, we see it being rolled back. And not just at European level. This is a phenomenon we see everywhere. Parliamentary democracy is taking the back seat. Governments in times of crises get extraordinary powers, and critics go quiet. And this is a very worrying development. I mean, you said that I was known for asking awkward questions. Well, thank you very much. I take that as a compliment, because I consider that my job. And actually, in the UK, there is a long tradition of strong parliamentary scrutiny, holding government to account, being very critical. And I think Brexit is one of the reasons why parliamentary democracy in Europe has taken a blow, why the European Parliament has been weakened, because the Brits left and took that tradition with them. And we see on the other side that because the Brits left, the Germans were kind of preoccupied with themselves for a while. And that empty space was filled by France. I love France, lovely country, wonderful people. They have many good things, but the one thing they don't have is parliamentary democracy. It's a foreign concept. They have a presidential democracy, and they have a parliament. The parliament is, the government. I mean, we've seen in the last year how a government can pass the budget or a pension reform by decree. I mean, this is something which is unimaginable in most other countries. So you can see that in this general decline of parliamentary democracy, this was an additional problem for the European Parliament, plus the fact that COVID hit, so members of parliament couldn't meet, couldn't get to know each other. And I do think this is a problem. It's not just a problem for decision making, because we see a commission which has indeed, as you described, it has taken lots of initiatives for purchasing vaccines, purchasing weapons, and sending them to Ukraine, taking decisions on enlargement, Eurobonds, inflation, energy prices. So very, very important decisions. But there is actually no scrutiny or hardly any scrutiny and hardly any accountability. I mean, accountability is almost zero by now. Also because Parliament, and here I have to be critical of my own institution, because Parliament is weak. Parliament is not using all its powers to hold the European Commission to account. And when we're talking about decisions that affect people's lives, decisions that involve spending lots of money, decisions that involve war and peace, quite literally, there has to be accountability. And we also have to make sure that the Commission, which is a powerful body, is held to account, is scrutinized. And I think this, if I may conclude on this, the one very important moment to sort of restore the balance, at least somewhat, between the European Parliament and the Commission will be after the European elections, when the Parliament has to elect the President of the European Commission. I think it is absolutely vital that the European Parliament sticks to the so-called Spitzenkandidat, lead candidate system, which is really about Parliament choosing its own candidate and not just signing on the dotted line for the appointment of the candidate chosen by the government leaders. I'll stop there.
That's really interesting. Can I just ask you one very quick, if you could answer really briefly, you mentioned the role of the Commission. What about the role of the Council? What's the level of scrutiny on the Council, and how high should it be? Okay,
I'll be very brief on that, because I think the European Council of Government Leaders is one of the most problematic bodies, which is in the middle of a giant power grab in broad daylight, and people don't even realize it. It's a body which has no formal powers. but it's beginning to operate like a kind of European government, but without a mandate, without being accountable to anybody. It's meeting behind closed doors. It's horse trading because they decide with unanimity. It's exceeding its powers the whole time. And, as I said, it's not accountable to the European Parliament, not to national parliaments. It's hugely problematic, not least because, let's say, part of the government leaders are either authoritarians or corrupt, or both in many cases, and they are taking decisions or blocking decisions which are affecting all of our lives, and we cannot hold them to account. And I think this has absolutely no place in a modern, mature democracy.
Thank you. Well, that provided the perfect transition, really, to Catherine. As Sophie mentioned, yes, some European government leaders are authoritarian and are illiberal. So let's talk a little bit about the role of national politics in the European project. So, I think most people seem to agree that Brexit has pretty much vaccinated everybody else in Europe about against the idea of actually leaving. But Europe still faces some very significant challenges, not just from the sort of illiberal likes of Viktor Orban in Hungary and Law and Justice in Poland, but from a whole raft of populist and nationalist, usually but not always far right, parties across the continent that just have a very different view of what the EU should be. Now, Giorgia Meloni in Italy seems to be going out of her way, or up until now at least, to sort of not to rock the boat too much. But a President Le Pen in France, which is a distinct possibility, might prove, a lot more obstructive. The AfD in Germany is second place in the polls, leading in some regions. Tell us a little bit about what's driving these parties, and how might it matter on the kind of European scale?
Sure, thank you. And I think that my points do connect to Sophie's points very directly, because many of the parties and the leaders that you evoked, one of their key arguments is that the European Union is unaccountable, that the European Union leads with little legitimacy, that it is removed from people's everyday concerns and daily lives, that they are technocrats that are essentially disconnected from the real world. And so, obviously, the EU has been the perfect object to attack. But they've obviously also made that argument with respect to their own national politicians, that these people are disconnected, unaccountable, illegitimate, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that one thing that's interesting to say from the get-go is that, we often talk about populist parties and then, far-right parties, and we put them all kind of in the same bath. But we have to be slightly careful, because in a sense, what's interesting about it is the fact that far-right parties, their main enemies are essentially those people who they dislike. They don't like migrants, they don't like minorities, they don't like people who are different. They are nationalists. Those are their enemies. What we see with populist parties, and the reasons why they have such an impact both on national politics and on EU politics, is that they also have another set of enemies, right? And the other enemies are this technocratic elite, whether it's the national one or the EU level one. So they have been, very effective, I think, in essentially positioning themselves as representatives of those people who feel voiceless and who feel unrepresented. And this is, it's quite a clever thing that they've done. And, and this is something that we need to take into account, is how well some of them have adapted to these new challenges. They have gone to look for very different kinds of voters. They have gone to look for voters who feel disenfranchised, disenfranchised, who feel cast aside, who feel that they are no longer represented maybe by the traditional parties. In some ways, if we look at France, this is a case in point. The Rassemblement National, its electorate has evolved from a relatively bourgeois, older electorate based in, relatively affluent or middle class parts of France. And it's now actually boosted much more by voters, who are lower income voters, who once might have voted for left-wing parties or social democratic parties, but now, are much more easily swayed by, I think, parties like Meloni's, parties like Marine Le Pen's, who and her sidekick Jordan Bardella, who are very good at essentially, representing what they call the ordinary person, right? And there's a long tradition of this also in Italy, in different kinds of parties, both on the left, actually, and on the right. And this notion that these parties can represent the non-elite, that they can represent the people who have been kind of left behind, maybe even ridiculed, for their tastes, for their lifestyles. This is something that we saw a little bit of. I remember during the Brexit campaign and the Brexit debate, which was a sort of a rejection of a kind of cosmopolitanism that seemed very disrespectful of ordinary aspirations and ordinary lives. So I think that this is something that we need to factor in. I would say just a couple of quick things. One is that the governments in the countries of the European Union are more than ever in need of a level of cohesion and the capacity to act, partly because the challenges require a certain level of cohesion. You need to bring people along with, the demands of the Green Deal. You need to bring people along with the energy transition. You need to bring people along to consent, actually, to sending money and arms to Ukraine. And just precisely at the point where we need this national cohesion, of course, what we have is increasing fragmentation, increasing polarization. A number of places where we see is almost a 50-50 split, not unreminiscent of what we see in the United States. Poland, for example, which is a extremely polarized and therefore, in danger of grinding to a halt, but also versions of fragmentation, right? That in France, in Italy, we see this, where actually governments, they may well be overstepping their roles and they may well be unaccountable, but the fact is also they're having a very difficult time getting things done. Therefore, I think behaving in ways such as the way that Sophie pointed out, basically ramming reforms through because they cannot secure a majority, right? And I think that this is one of the key questions, is whether these parties actually are creating a situation which is, extremely dangerous, where in fact there is no possibility of finding consensus or even consent on some of these crucial issues, because they're being used as wedge issues, whether it's immigration, whether it's the Green Deal, whether it's Ukraine. They're being, relentlessly
exploited by,
and this is the challenge.
Yeah. Well, that's a really, really interesting point. Let's move on now. I'm a little bit conscious of the time, to talk about specifically about some of these actual challenges. And you mentioned one there, Catherine, immigration. I'm going to start with that one because it's in the news today. There, you may have seen on the Guardian's, the new Guardian's Europe live blog that we started last week. There was a EU minister were meeting in Brussels today to try and agree the new rules that they would apply in the event of a future migration crisis of the kind that we saw in 2015, when more than, I think, 1.3 million people came to Europe. Now, I mean, it is an incredibly divisive issue. The EU's top diplomat, Joseph Borrell, told The Guardian last week that he thought migration could prove what he called a dissolving force for the EU. So kind of, strong are the disagreements about how to deal with it. And that was just a couple of days after Ursula von der Leyen visited Lampedusa in Italy, this little island of 5,000 people that over the course of a few days had seen 11,000 people arrive. So there's still this meeting in Brussels today. Apparently we're heading towards an agreement, but we're not there yet. There are several countries still opposed, Italy, Hungary, of course. And meanwhile, Germany alone has received more than 77% more asylum applications this year than last. So it's an immense issue, and it's a global issue. Rokhaya, I'd like to ask first, Rokhaya, what should Europe be doing, do you think? And then I'd like to ask Sophie, what can it do, and what is it actually doing? Let's start with you, Rokhaya. What should Europe be doing to? I mean, it's a huge global issue.
Yes, it's a global issue, and as you mentioned, all of the countries of Europe are not contributing in the same way. Germany in 2015 and this year has been welcoming more migrants than any other countries. So it means that being part of the same union means that we should think together and have a common policy when it comes to welcoming migrants. But what I want to tackle is to remind the context in which the European Union was founded. It was after the Second World War, and it was after long years of strong oppression. And I think that we speak a lot about Europe as a number of institutions, of laws, of elections, but we tend to forget that it's also about values. And I think that the continent should be reminded its own values and hold on to them, because I don't hear that much about the fact that we were also founded out of the idea of maybe making better than our predecessors, and no longer fell into respecting human rights. And being, on a continent on the border of which thousands of people have been drowning over the last 2 decades, knowing the fact that Europe is requesting to countries in Africa to take care of immigration, and we've seen what has happened in Tunisia this summer. They just let them die in the desert without food, without water, and we know that. We let Libya, Tunisia taking care of people who are refugees, and we know that they do not respect our standards, the standards that are the ones that are supposed to be the ones of the EU. So I think that we should really watch, like really look at us in the mirror and really think about how we care about those values and how we really intend to apply them, and to the fact that it's not like Europe is not only Germany. So there are many countries that could also do their part. They could take their own share. And once again, it's important to say that we are going to, our interests are going to other countries. So if we are able to have companies being settled in Africa, I don't know why African couldn't come to a continent that basically exploits many of their resources and gain much money out of their pockets.
Mm. Sophie, European values, how are they being translated into actual action? Are they being translated into action?
No. The external borders of the European Union are the most deadly borders in the world. And there will be a time where this continent will have to answer to history. Just as we did, I mean, colonialism has been mentioned, slavery, there are a couple of other ugly blots on our track record, and this is one of them. There are tens of thousands of dead people in the Mediterranean. It's a graveyard. And there are probably even more who died in the desert because they were turned back, or they ended up in a concentration camp in Libya, because let's call it that way. Or, you know, I mean, it's really what we are doing to people is incredible, really incredible. And the point is, I'm a bit tired of hearing the term migration crisis. You know, this crisis is the result of policy choices. The whole idea that there are more and more and more, yes, there are more people migrating, there are more people fleeing than ever before in history, but the vast majority of them are not coming to Europe. Actually, the migration numbers are fairly stable. And then we are looking mainly at refugees, asylum seekers, which is only a very small part of the total. And it is actually, it's not a matter of governments struggling with an answer to this and trying to solve it. Yes, they are, but to a certain extent, they're also exploiting it for political purposes. Let's look at Lampedusa. Everybody can see the images. It is indeed, it's totally unmanageable for the people in Lampedusa. It's, you know, so many people. But you know why? I mean, the total number of arrivals in Italy hasn't gone up, but there was a policy change under the new government, because before they would actually do search and rescue operations at sea and take people to other ports in Italy. They've stopped that. So now everybody is arriving in Lampedusa and not in the other places anymore. Oh, isn't it a wonderful photo opportunity? So we travel there if you're the Prime Minister or the President of the European Commission. Sorry if I sound a little bit cynical, but I really feel that this is not just your average policy issue. We're talking about human beings. I found, you know, one of the most horrible things that I've seen in a long time, the shipwreck at Pylos in Greece, which was the result of the Greek Coast Guard trying to tow a ship, which was, of course, completely overburdened and everything, into Italian waters so that, you know, Greece didn't have to deal with it. 600 people drowned because they were trapped like rats, mainly women and children. Now, if this would happen, and of course, you know, it got a lot of media visibility, but if this were to happen to, I don't know, a cruise ship, you know, filled with Europeans, I don't think that it would have disappeared off the front pages so quickly. I also think, because I hear you saying this, I hear very often, yeah, it's very, very difficult to find agreement. No, it's not difficult to find agreement. It's very difficult to find agreement in intergovernmental Europe. If you take decisions with vetoes or quasi-vetoes with 27 member states, yeah, then it's difficult. Also because none of them, not a single one, and this is the nature of the intergovernmental setup of the Union, none of them will take responsibility for the European Union as a whole. They only take responsibility for their electorates back home, and migration is a wonderful campaigning issue. If you look at, because you say, you know, we had, for example, 2015, over 1 million people came here fleeing the civil war in Syria. And a big problem, Angela Merkel, who said, we can do it, we are schaffen das, but there were lots of problems in other member states. I mean, how many Ukrainians have we now welcomed in Europe? And so somebody needs to explain to me why that was put. In my country, for example, 90% of Ukrainians are in work. They're having a job, you know, they're integrated. Whereas people coming from Syria, they've been sitting around for years, frustrated, traumatized, you know, more and more often in the Netherlands, one of the richest countries in the world, where we let women and children sleep outside. They don't get food, they don't get medication. Children are not going to school, the richest country in the world. So if we think that we, as a country, which incidentally has a shrinking and aging population and is needs of labor force, if we cannot handle this, and if we cannot take the responsibility for a proper common EU asylum and migration policy, then how do we expect other parts of the world to deal with it? Sorry for being a bit excited, but I really feel
you're absolutely right.
We're talking about values here.
No, you're absolutely right. I'm keen to move on because we've got a couple more issues that I would really like to address, at least briefly, before we start taking questions from our audience. So the second one is the climate crisis, climate breakdown. And Catherine, I'd like to address this to you if I could. So the European Council on Foreign Relations, which is a respected think tank, published a report today that said Europe was at a make or break moment with regard to the climate crisis. This week, both the British government and the Swedish government have been very strongly criticised for kind of rowing back on climate commitments. Germany is in trouble on that as well. I mean, there does seem to be a real, what you might call a green lash underway, both by citizens who are sort of anxious about the costs, what it's actually going to cost them, and increasingly by politicians who are worried about the sort of political cost rather than the financial cost, and how many votes they're going to lose because of the policies that they're going to have to push through. And more governments coming down the line, potentially, who are going to take a kind of nationalist or at least a sort of non-internationalist line on this. How important is this problem? I mean, along with migration, you know, the climate crisis is one of these huge global issues that Europe is going to have to face.
Yes, absolutely, and also along with migration, it's quite a useful issue to kind of split your electorates, right? You know, first of all, it bears some resemblance with, you know, the migration issue, because if you're even on the mainstream right, but certainly, you know, on the populist right, and sometimes even on the populist left, you know, you can argue that this is that these are decisions that are going to affect, you know, people on lower income disproportionately. You can also make it out to be an extremely technical set of policies that in a sense get kind of railroaded through with not a lot of public scrutiny. So, you know, there's a kind of the fact that, you know, we're getting the backlash on green policy as immigration is back on the agenda. You know, these are two, as you say, two powerful issues, and they can be used extremely effectively. I think what's worrying about it is a couple of things. One is that we're seeing more and more the so-called mainstream right, you know, start to work in alliance with the populist right. You know, we've seen this in the European Parliament, particularly on biodiversity, for instance. So, you know, ad hoc alliances around these issues between people who are sort of not entirely deniers, but, you know, flirting with the idea that climate is, you know, not necessarily such an urgent matter, and flirting with the people who are, you know, industrialists and the industrial lobbies, who are not necessarily deniers, but who are delayers. And, you know, and we're finding this alliance, you know, emerging, you know, at the national level, and we're seeing it, you know, we've seen it in action at the European Parliament. There's a sense in which if the European election results are what we think they will be, you know, with probably a larger European People's Party on the right and more votes for the populist and nationalist right, that actually this might really slow down, you know, the progress of these policies. So this is a big deal. And just to finish on this, it also connects, I think, to some of the, you know, the international to the role that Europe can aspire to play internationally. Europe, you know, can aspire to play a role in terms of almost a kind of, you know, a superpower of regulation, and, you know, and it has particularly tried to do so on climate. But of course, if you take, for example, Emmanuel Macron's speech, you know, and his declaration recently on what he was going to do nationally in France for climate adaptation. I mean, you know, it is incredibly watered down. And one of the reasons it's incredibly watered down is that, you know, you've got, you know, a French population and a European population saying things like, well, why should we be making an effort? When in fact, you know, look at what China is doing. You know, we're not the ones who are going to make a difference. we're not going to make a difference on this policy. So please first solve the stuff to do with China, and then you can come and tell us what we need to do on climate. And there's this weird trade-off going on here, which I think is also problematic.
Okay, thanks very much. I just want to very briefly tackle one more question, and then there's quite a few questions coming in, several of which are going to work very well. I just want to address this one very briefly, and I think, Sophie, you're probably best placed to answer it, but briefly, if you could. We touched on it a little bit earlier, but it's the question of enlargement. And that's one of the really big changes that's been triggered. I mean, it was always a question, but it's really been triggered by the war in Ukraine, obviously, this question of enlargement. It's going to be absolutely critical, and it's probably going to be top of most EU officials' inboxes for the next few months at the very least. So last summer, the EU added Ukraine and Moldova to its list of official candidates. They already include Albania, Serbia, Kosovo, Turkey, Montenegro, North Macedonia, Bosnia and Herzegovina. Now that's a huge institutional deal, isn't it? I mean, that raises massive questions about, about the budget, what's going to happen about some countries that are currently net recipients are going to become, net payers into the EU budget. What would Ukraine, which is one of the world's biggest grain producers, going to mean for the common agricultural policy? EU decision-making methods will absolutely have to be fundamentally reformed to take account of this sheer number of new members. And amid all of that, any existing member can veto the accession of any potential new member. How is that? Is it going to happen? Is it going to be possible? Is it going to trigger some kind of meltdown in the union that we have at the moment?
I have no crystal ball, but I very much hope it's going to happen. And I think it needs to happen soon. When the heads of government last year granted the candidate status to Ukraine and also Moldova, they probably thought like, oh, well, this is going to last another 20 years. I'll be retired by then. It will be somebody else's problem. But of course, people like Zelensky and the president of Moldova, they think differently about this, and I think they're absolutely right. I think it is of crucial strategic importance for the European Union to now see through the accession of indeed the countries on the Western Balkans, which have been in the waiting room for far too long, and which makes them very susceptible to influences of Russia and China. But also Ukraine and Moldova, and at some point also Georgia. I think Turkey is a different debate, but these countries have to join quickly. And I think we also have to fundamentally change the accession process. The whole idea, which goes back to the early 90s, which was maybe suitable for the world then, and the so-called acquis, the whole body of EU legislation then, 30 years ago, is not suitable for today, because a procedure that lasts for 20 years, and you first have to tick all the boxes, and then you have to wait indeed if no country is going to use a veto, that doesn't work anymore. So I think there should indeed be a new procedure with a staged accession, but it should be crystal clear that the final stage there is full membership, because I hear also President Macron floating the idea of a kind of B status recreational membership. Sorry, that is just, and you know why they're proposing that? It's because they have absolutely no appetite for any reforms, and I think institutional reforms and reforms of the agriculture policy are long overdue. And indeed, if the European Union is going to collapse under this weight, it's because of the inability and refusal of national governments to reform. So I do hope that they're going to take responsibility and that this enlargement is going to take place, because in the world of today, I don't think that we can afford missing this opportunity, because if you know, in the minds of some, at least, we are still living safely somewhere under the umbrella of the United States, and we can actually pick and choose. That's not the case anymore. In the world of today, we need to be strong, we need to be big, we need to be united, and government leaders. And if you allow me one last thing, because really the issue of intergovernmental Europe, whereby not just national governments, but government leaders in particular, prime ministers, who are becoming sort of little presidents through their role in the European Council, is extremely problematic and is paralyzing and blocking and slowing down a lot of vital developments and vital decisions.
Okay, thank you. Right, I think it's time to take questions from the audience, and there's a lot coming in. Some really great questions. Rokhaya, this whole question of on the kind of human rights question in Europe and human rights. So an anonymous viewer here asks, is it me or does it not seem that oh, hang on, it's just moved. Sorry, yes, is it me or does it not seem that many European governments, including our own, I'm not sure where this person's from, seem to be taking us back to a world before the UN conventions on human rights that were established in the 40s and 50s? Can we afford to go back to a world where the persecuted were being turned away as they were during the Second World War? And Jens asks, how can the EU appeal even to the basics of human rights and at the same time force people back at its borders to near certain death, or let them drown before the eyes of its very own representatives? Since every member of Frontex, that's the EU Border Protection Force, you know, is a representative of the EU and should act as one. What's your, I mean, is the, you know, you talked about the EU's values, the EU principles, it's abandoned them when it comes to this question?
Yes, yes, indeed. I don't hear that many European leaders holding on those values and claiming them. It used to be something that was much valued, that was central to the mainstream discourse, and it's not the case anymore. And I guess that the fact that we have more and more voters that are choosing the far right makes the whole political spectrum shifting to the right. And even the center, France has been mentioned a lot, and I think I will add something about that. But the fact that, you know, a center right government like the one that was picked by Emmanuel Macron is, you know, maybe like is adopting an anti-Muslim discourse instead of, you know, maybe going back to what was Macron's discourse during the campaign. It's because the far right is one of the main force in the French context. Marine Le Pen has managed to have 89 MPs elected locally, and since 2014, France is one of the countries that sends the largest number of far right MEPs in the European Parliament. So that's something that also sends a message to the political leaders, and instead of fighting the influence of those ideology, they try to be appealing to the people who choose the far right, and they don't try to challenge those ideas, but to include those ideas in their political programs. And that's the problem, because speaking about human rights today is, you know, being labeled, you know, woke. That's what's happening today. If you claim human rights, basic human rights, you're labeled woke. You're perceived as being influenced by some, you know, radicals in the US. And that's the thing, is that like today it's negative to stand for, you know, racial equality, for gender equality, for, you know, for welcoming people who seek asylum. And that's there is a reverse in the perception of values that used to be the ground of the European Union.
That's a depressing thought, isn't it? Yeah. Thanks, Rokhaya. Just a reminder to people watching, if you want to send us questions, please keep sending in. If you're watching on Zoom, then you can use the Q&A button that should be at the bottom of your screen. And if you're watching on the site on guardian.com, then reach us by Twitter or X, as it's now known, with the hashtag Guardian Live, or just at us directly at Guardian Live. Catherine, two questions on the future of the EU and the threat from inside and also outside. So Joshua asks, how can the European Union survive this wave of leaders and parties who openly oppose the Union and their country's membership? I'm not sure it's true to say they oppose their country's membership, but they certainly oppose the way that the EU works at the moment. So thinking of Meloni, Le Pen, Law and Justice, etc. Tim Cole in London, who I think I might know, asks, what do European politicians need to do now to ensure that in 4 years' time, Presidents Trump, Le Pen and Putin don't badly damage the EU and European unity? I mean, I think that triumvirate between them is an appalling prospect. Trump, just to remind you, the last time Trump was in power, he called Brussels a hellhole and the EU his enemy. And I think if he is re-elected, he could be even more violent at least in his words than he was then. And finally, Catherine, sorry, a question from Dimitro, who's in the UK. I'll summarize it here. Should it be possible for the EU to kind of fire member states who, are actively obstructing and opposing the work of the Union?
Well, okay, that's some straight questions here. A couple of things, I suppose. One is on the idea of what to do to deal with some of these troublesome members, but also some of these troublesome leaders. I think one of the things that's quite clear, and that the EU, to be fair, has got a little bit better in doing, is that whether it's Orban, whether it's the peace in Poland, where they are in power, actually these people are incredibly susceptible to money, right? For all the huge rhetoric, all the ideological rhetoric, the fact is that they're constantly horse trading and asking for more cash. And actually withholding cash, making cash conditional, it all sounds a bit grubby, but it's, relatively effective. One of the few reasons why Meloni actually, didn't actually use her first year to be entirely appalling is the fact that she is waiting on the final tranche of the recovery package, right? So I know it sounds like cut rate politics, but the fact is that it's not an ineffective way of dealing with them and, and kind of trading off good behavior and rewarding it, quote unquote, with some of this cash. This, of course, is kind of once the evil has been done, if you like, right? Once they're in power. But surely, there's something that needs to be done, ahead of this, in order to really tackle them head on. And Rokhaya, referred to the fact that here you have a lot of parties essentially aping, right, imitating the far right. When everybody knows that actually everybody loses out in this kind of game. I think that this is an incredibly slippery slope. It's incredibly short-termist, and this is where it values, right? It goes back to whether or not you're going to be able to, once you get into power, right, and you've promised, as the French would say, n'importe quoi, are you really going to do this or not? Are you going to break further promises, and therefore continue to alienate these voters? I think, there's a huge lack of integrity and honesty here. The question on firing member states, I would say actually that what needs to be done is to try to rein them in, strengthen pro-democracy movements, stick to the values rather than throw people out. How do we deal with Trump, Putin, and Le Pen? First of all, I'm hoping that it doesn't actually come to this, even though we're playing a very dangerous game. There's a couple of things that I think, or one thing that I think we need to factor in, and maybe it's false hope, but it's the fact that these, particularly Putin and Trump are incredibly mercurial and unpredictable characters, right? So, we're seeing an alliance between Putin and Trump, in the distance. Actually, yes, maybe, but who knows? What would Le Pen do? She would be hugely, constrained by some of the French institutions, even though she would be president of the Republic. So I think that we should always keep in mind that these people are problematic in part because they're unpredictable. And so it's very hard to know what it would look like right now.
Mm. Okay, Sophie, anything to add on? Can the EU survive Trump, a second Trump?
Well, the thing is that, if you think of it, it's really silly that we are, we're all jittery because of the elections on the other side of the big pond. If Europe were really strong and independent, then we wouldn't need to worry so much. So I think we need to get our act together and pretty damn quick. But I think also, and part of this is also the institutional reforms, the governance reforms. And I think when the issue of the rule of law, for example, yes, we have the tool of what we call budget conditionality when member states get no money if they don't meet the rule of law standards. But there's something else. We have a whole body of law, treaties, case law, and what have you, which has to be enforced by the European Commission. The Commission is let's say the enforcer in chief, the guardian of the treaties, as we call it. The problem here is, again, the institutional setup. The European Commission is made up of one member coming from each member state. So there are 27 member states, 27 commissioners, and they're supposed to be independent. The treaties say so. The problem is, in practice, they are serving the member state governments. If you look at the let's say the statistics on enforcement, it is in steep decline, because over the decades, the European Commission has become more and more intergovernmental, catering to the wishes of the national governments rather than enforcing the law, which is in the interest of the citizens. So there is something for which we don't even need treaty change, because it's already in the treaties, and that is make the Commission smaller. The thing is, it's in the treaties, but the small print said, okay, we're going to make the Commission smaller, small print, unless the member states don't want it. Okay, and the ink on the treaties wasn't dry yet, and of course they had already said we're not going to apply this provision. But I think this is essential. If you cut this umbilical cord between the member states and the Commission, then it will finally be free and independent to enforce the law, enforce the treaties, and move in when member states don't comply with the law. Because we now have intergovernmental Europe, which is based not on the presumption of compliance, but pretense of compliance. And the Commission just doesn't know what to do anymore when national governments are violating the law. And it's not just Poland and Hungary. There are many more countries. One country that I'm particularly worried about is Greece, which you also see excesses in other countries. And the European Commission is just completely paralyzed, not doing anything anymore. So this is one of the big changes that we need, is a truly independent European Commission.
Okay, there's a lot of questions, Rokhaya. People who are very worried about the future of Europe and the EU, about, an anonymous person here asking, is there any hope? How can you, are there any solutions to these? Sophie asks, do you see any solutions to these problems around European democracy and all these illiberal and far-right politicians? And maybe also I can attach that, it's not really the same question, but Lily in the UK asks, is the EU actually relevant anymore? Shouldn't we now be working with rising economies, the other side of the world, like the BRICS economies, rather than, rather than with Europe?
I think that Sophie may answer to the second question better than I would. I can't I can't predict the future, of course, but I'm sure we have the means and the solutions to be a land of human rights. The question is the political will. Are we really willing to hold on to those principles? And that's something else, like, having politicians who care more about their elections than about the destiny, the future of the continent, is also has consequence. Like, as I think it was Sophie who was saying, like, that people were just being open to the application of many countries that are not in the US, in the EU for now, because they know that they would be retired they thought they would be retired by the time we would have to deal with that. And I think it's the problem is to have politicians that have very short-term visions and that don't really build something for decades, but think about how they can manage to be re-elected and to keep their positions. So I don't think that we lack solutions, but we lack leaders who are really willing to do something for the European people.
Okay, thank you. Catherine, we have a question again from an anonymous viewer on just sort of more about external relations and the sort of, and basically treading the tightrope between US and China, the US and China, and this whole idea of strategic autonomy. How has the question really is, has strategic autonomy been dealt a kind of, fatal blow by Russia's invasion of Ukraine? Has the EU kind of gone running back under the NATO umbrella? And how can it navigate that kind of strategic competition between the USA and China? Is that can Europe walk that tightrope?
Well, I don't know if it's been, if strategic autonomy has been dealt a fatal blow. It certainly has been, it's certainly quite the reality check, that's for sure. But I think that, it would be wrong to equate, a strengthening of NATO with, the absence of strategic autonomy for the EU. I think that, there's a way in which these two can definitely work hand in hand. In fact, they both work better if the two work hand in hand. I think that the US-China question is an interesting one, partly because here is where you see that the EU as such is a collection of national governments. These national governments do have national interests, and if you take Macron as an example, calling for a probe or an investigation into Chinese electric vehicles, it's very easy for Germany to turn around and say, well, he would call for that, wouldn't he? Because he doesn't sell that many cars to Germany. The interests are just, perceived as being fundamentally at odds. And I think that, we are in a moment here where, not to get too EU focused on it, but, where the relationship between France and Germany, without over-egging the batter about its importance. Nevertheless, it is a crucially important relationship. And here, there is the interests don't necessarily align in an obvious way. So can the EU walk this tightrope? There is internal negotiations to be had, and I think we've seen von der Leyen take one course, we've seen Macron take another course, Germany take a third course, and I think that it's going to be increasingly difficult to toe that line. But this is precisely where strategic autonomy comes back in, right? And where that becomes an important point to secure that capacity to do that.
Thank you. Sophie, Jenny R. in Spain says she's very depressed to hear you talking about accountability and the European Parliament not using its powers to hold the Commission accountable. She says it's a decades-old debate, which was certainly alive when I worked in Brussels in the late 1990s, early 2000s. Is that because European elections simply aren't considered important at a national level, or because MEPs don't actually have the power to act that they need? And is it too late to change that? And a related question from Catherine. Isn't simply the case that the EU is already too big as it is? If it can't kind of govern itself, these issues of organisation and accountability are already problematic, how much worse is it going to get when the new members arrive?
Well, but I'll come back to what I started with. It all depends on how we organise our governance. India is bigger than the European Union. China is bigger, and it can be governed. So it all depends on how you organize it. So we cannot duck this question. We cannot say, oh, well, it's not interesting, too academic. We don't want to talk about it. I heard Catherine say just now, well, essentially the European Union is a cooperation between national governments. This is the whole point, because that intergovernmental setup is not suitable for the challenges of today. We need a lot more, a more supranational European Union and a supranational democracy. Now, I also start to come to the question of Jenny, I believe it was, about the European Parliament. There are lots of things that should improve. Yes, the European Parliament should get more powers. Yes, MEPs should be more assertive and all the rest of it. But when will people take an interest? That's not when we sort of ramp up our campaigns, it's when it's about power. And this is why this question of the so-called Spitzenkandidat, the lead candidate, is so important, because that question is not about the competences of the individual candidate. It's not about political color of the candidate or nationality. It's about one question only. Who determines who is the president of the European Commission? And it should be the European Parliament. It should be like in any normal, mature democracy, the leader of the most important position should be the outcome of elections, not the outcome of horse trading between government leaders behind closed doors. I always say even the Vatican, the election of the Pope is more transparent than this, because there at least you know who the candidates are. This like people are going to the ballot station. Imagine this, and we'll ask them to vote. And we say, but we'll tell you who your leader is after the elections. I mean, you cannot do this, so it has to change. It has to change. And then, yes, can the European Union then grow bigger and is still manageable? Yes, absolutely. And you know what? It's going to be good for our well-being, for our prosperity, for our security, for all the things that we want to achieve. And I would like to say one thing, because sometimes people indeed get gloomy. Yes, the challenge we are facing are massive. And sometimes you think like climate, war, everything that's happening is just so big. I'd like to just close the curtains and pretend it's, I want it to all go away. But I think let's do one thing, take one step back and look over our shoulders where we came from. We had the capacity as Europeans. I mean, we've done horrific things, but we've also had the capacity to do amazing things. I mean, if you look at the war situation in Ukraine now, and if you think back to, the rubble and the blood-soaked earth after 2 world wars, can you imagine that at the time what we did was reach out to each other and say, you know what? We've been killing each other, we've been murdering, there's been the Holocaust and everything, but we are going to build a common future. And we did it. And yes, we got the human rights and the United Nations and the Council of Europe and all the rest of it. Are we messing up right now? Yes. And we will probably do so again in the future. But we still have this capacity. We haven't lost the capacity. So let's use it to face these challenges and fix the problems. Because if we want to, as you also said, if the courage is there, if the will is there, then we can, absolutely.
Thank you very much. Well, that's a rousing note of hope to end on. Thank you very much. We're pretty much out of time. I'm just going to end with one really nice comment, not a question, but a comment that kind of underscores what Sophie just said, from Fiona, who's in Canada. She says, as a Canadian, I live in Southern Ontario, and a progressive, I applaud the European Union's principles, even if they're not all being adequately honoured at present. I hope and pray that the European project can find its way towards some sort of healing of its divisions, because the rest of the world badly needs a body of the size of the EU, with all its diversity, that places such values as human rights and equity at its centre. Thank you very much for that. Well, listen, thank you. We are out of time. I hope we answered quite a few of your questions. Thank you so much for asking them. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you all very much for joining. We'd love to hear what you thought of the event, so please let us know. There's a survey, if you're watching on Zoom, that you should receive, or of course on social media. Please do continue to support The Guardian. The Guardian's Europe edition is going to provide a growing readership in Europe, with news and insight that matters through a genuinely European lens. That's our aim. You can support us from a mere €2 a month, so please feel free. You can find out more at theguardian.com. And finally, huge thanks to our panelists, Catherine Fieschi, Rokhaya Diallo, and Sophie Veld. I'm sure you agree it was a great discussion. Thank you very much indeed. And above all,